Hi, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to this webinar on the resurgence of alien land laws, which we've seen all across the South and the country, and also in Georgia and SB 132. My name is Jennifer Lee, and I'm the Policy Director at Asian Americans Advancing Justice Atlanta. Advancing Justice Atlanta is a nonprofit legal advocacy organization dedicated to protecting the civil and human rights of Asian Americans in Georgia. And I'm going to introduce our panelists in just a minute, but just a couple of housekeeping things. We are going to be recording the webinar, and after this presentation, we will send out the slides and a link to the recording. So don't worry, we will send that information out. Feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat with your name and your organization if that is relevant. And also feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We will have time for Q&A at the end. So with that, I'm gonna introduce our panelists. We have a great group of panelists from all across the country. First, Lily True is the Interim Executive Director of Asian Texans for Justice, joining us from Texas. Lily has worked in the Texas House of Representatives, and she was also a graduate fellow at the Archer Center for Public Policy with the University of Texas. Lily additionally has over 10 years of experience working in the private sector as well. We also have Dr. Russell Jung with us, who's a professor of Asian American Studies at San Francisco State University and the author of many books and articles on race and religion. Dr. Jung is also one of the original co-founders of Stop AAPI Hate, which is a coalition founded in 2020 and was named as one of Time's 100 most influential persons in 2021. And also received the Game Changer Award from the Asia Society in 2022. Tim Herr is a national speaker who has 15 years of experience in real estate. He's a graduate of Georgia Tech, and he is also currently the managing broker for Point Honors and Associates Realtors. Tim served on the National Association of Realtors as the 2018 chair for diversity and as an advocate for fair housing. He is also the immediate past national president of the Asian Real Estate Association of America. And last but not least, we have Tom Phan, who's a senior policy associate at Asian Americans Advancing Justice Atlanta. Tom authored the recent report titled Modern Day Alien Land Laws, Resurgence Throughout the South, which we will send out a link to. And I hope you all check it out. And previously, he's worked as a state budget and tax analyst at the organization South Carolina Appleseed. He also worked as a fair housing advocate in Boston, helping people who had experienced illegal housing discrimination. And with that, I'll just go over briefly what we will cover in our webinar today, and then we'll get right to our panelists. If you can advance the slides, please. Yeah, that's great. So this is a little bit of what our speakers are going to talk about today, and you'll get the full context of sort of the historical precedents of these laws, what's happening today, and some of the implications. So I'm going to start actually with Tom. And Tom, if you can just start with giving us an overview of what these types of laws, like what do they actually do and who do they impact?
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. Yeah, these bills prohibit certain foreign nationals from owning and purchasing agricultural land, but also real property in various states throughout the United States. And the report looks into 10 southern states in particular. And some of them even try to dispossess people who already own land. And for SB 132, it does just that, as well as has a radio restriction, a 25-mile radius restriction from any military installation, which includes military camps, training facilities, and throughout Georgia, there are 10 military installations, and then even more, 10 military bases and even more military installations throughout the South. And some of them are in highly populated cities such as Atlanta, Augusta, Columbus, and Savannah. So it has far-reaching implications and restricts people from who are coming to the U.S. from certain foreign nations. These laws target people coming from China and Hong Kong, Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, and North Korea, and that's SB 132 specifically. Other states reference other lists and kind of target a various number of other countries, but all of them target foreign nationals from China.
So earlier you said dispossession. What does that mean exactly?
So if a person who's a foreign national of a restricted country already owns land, then they would have to sell it or not have ownership of it in any way. And sometimes they're given 2 to 3 years, depending on how they acquired it. If it was acquired by a payment of debt or inheritance, then there's some period, some grace period, if you will, where they can just sell off or no longer own the property and not face penalization.
So in addition to the disposition, like dispossession, what do the laws prohibit exactly?
In Georgia, it prohibits possessory interests, which can actually also include rentals or any interests that companies may have as well, foreign companies that may have some kind of stake or interest in property that is located, say, in Georgia, and those entities would also be impacted.
And I think Tim Herr, our real estate expert, may have some insight into that later too. So just going back to some of these bills proposals, they sound problematic. So I'm curious, like, what are some of the legal issues that are raised by these bills?
Yeah, some of them are, I'll go ahead and name them and I'll get into them. Fair housing violations, equal protection under the 14th Amendment, and then the Supremacy Clause. So for a fair housing violation, it encourages realtors, sellers to discriminate against buyers of property. And they would have to kind of determine whether or not this person is a foreign national from China, and that would be illegal under the Fair Housing Act, which prohibits any form of discrimination against people in protected classes, which includes national origin or nation of origin. And it could lead to, especially when there is a 25-mile radius in Georgia, it could lead to illegal segregation where, people of a certain race, racial discrimination where people of a certain race cannot live in, say, Metro Atlanta, and they're steered away from those places and to other places to either rent or purchase, which is also illegal under the Fair Housing Act. And under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, similarly protects people of protected classes based on race, religion, nation of origin. And therefore it protects people from, if they were targeted for being from China, North Korea, Iran. So it's already been adjudicated, when alien land laws first occurred in the early to mid 19th century across a number of states, and it's already been ruled unconstitutional. And so we're seeing a resurrection of some of these archaic laws today. And as I've established, with it violating the Fair Housing Act and the Equal Protection Clause, it violates federal law, and federal law supersedes any local or state legislation. And therefore, these laws could be preempted by by federal legislation and be a violation of those protections that I mentioned.
Thank you. One last question, just because you sort of brought up that people involved in the real estate transaction would sort of have to confirm whether or not someone was like a foreign national from China when they're doing the transaction. How are these laws implemented? Like, how are they being implemented, or is there any discussion of how they should be implemented? What have you seen in terms of anything in these bills that talk about like implementation of the policy?
Right. In Georgia, it's not as clear. In Georgia, there's a residency requirement where people have to be in the country for a number of months throughout the year, be in the state, no less, for a number of months throughout the year in order to not be in violation of this law if they're a foreign national from one of these countries. But the enforcement of it in Georgia is not as clear. In other states. Purchasers have to sometimes sign an affidavit attesting that they are not a foreign national from one of these countries. And in other cases, attorney generals could file civil action against purchasers, and even real estate agents, sellers could be held responsible for making a sale that's of real property to someone that's on a restricted list. And in Florida, they have some penalties that range from a misdemeanor to up to a felony if a person is a foreign national from China who purchases real property. And others also have registrations for anyone who has already had the land and where they're not forced to dispossess themselves of it. They would still have to register to the fact that they are a foreign national from a certain country and are in ownership of agricultural land or real property.
Okay, thank you. I think that's a good segue to go into some of the like real estate concerns. So I'm going to turn it over to Tim Herr. Tim, from your perspective as a real estate professional, what are some of the other issues and consequences of these types of laws?
Well, there's a lot, and I apologize. I'm sitting in my hotel room. I'm in St. Louis today with the Realtor Association, and this is a very big concern within the realtor world. You mentioned in my my introduction that I was also the president of the Asian Real Estate Association of America. It's called ARIA. ARIA, we are the largest trade association, 18,000 members, 43 chapters nationwide, including Canada. And we've been watching these bills since it's been coming out the first day. It's escalating really fast, very quickly. And from an ARIA as well as from a real estate standpoint, from a realtor standpoint, we are very concerned. And I can speak more from the ARIA standpoint just because I was past president, and we're watching these bills very closely. But we're very concerned about these discriminatory laws. And it's under the guise of national security, right? And none of us are saying, hey, we're against national security. We're saying that this is an extreme, what's going on is a very extreme result of what's going on. And like, Tong mentioned, and you mentioned, country of origin is a protected class in the fair housing rights. So we're very concerned about the fair housing implications of all of this. And of course, the main focus right now, it is China, but there are a lot of states, including Georgia and Florida, that has been targeting other buyers from other countries as well. And I know Dr. Zhang will talk about it, but these laws are really, we can trace these laws back to in the anti-Asian legislations back to like 1850, right? Because during COVID, the pandemic really brought two different issues to the AA and HBI community. We had COVID, and then we had the surge of anti-Asian hate crimes that didn't help anything at all. And these bills that are coming out, they're guys, again, under national security threats. And we want to be very clear. And from a real estate person, we're very clear on saying, hey, look, when we talk about, because some other people have talked about Japan bombing Pearl Harbor. And for us, our standpoint is, look, that wasn't beyond a national security threat. That wasn't a declaration of war. And none of us, what happened after that was we rallied, we took all the people of Japanese descent and put them into concentration camps, right? These internment camps. And from an ARIA, we have members at ARIA, including our past president, Kurt Nishimura, and one of our founders, Alan Okamoto, that was directly affected by these Japanese internment camps. They have stories that they can tell because they're directly affected by it. So, on a federal level, we're saying, hey, there's already implementations in place. There's FinCEN, which, there's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network that already looks at foreign buyers, real estate buyers for money laundering. But I also want to take a step back because a lot of these discussions when these were first introduced happened because there was a Canadian LLC that had purchased thousands of acres next to a Montana military base. And that military base apparently has the ICBMs and our missiles. And that's why you're seeing a lot of military commentary on all these bills. And what they found out was this Canadian LLC was owned by the Chinese government. But all of us can agree that we don't want any foreign government, whether they're friendly or not, to own any military land especially that has our ICBMs. So it is an organized effort. They're using this as, I believe they're using this as a crux to kind of pass these laws. And when we look at the statistics, 3.1% of all agricultural land is actually owned by a foreign entity or a foreign person. And 62% of that is owned by 5 countries, none of which is China. And yes, Chinese ownership of US agricultural land has increased, but it's remained significantly less in other countries, and it's received less scrutiny. It's the 18th largest agricultural land owner as a foreign entity compared to China, which ranks at first. They own like 12 billion acres. China owns 380 acres. So it's a very extreme case. And you guys have talked about Florida. Let's talk about Florida for a second, and I'll talk about Georgia in a second. I know that's one of the questions, and I apologize for rambling on a little bit, but Florida has passed one of the most restrictive anti-Asian real estate bills in the US. It is absolutely bonkers how this even got passed. And when we asked the legislatures that actually passed this, because it passed bipartisan, the Democrats and Republicans said, oh, we had no idea this is what this bill was about. This was because it was, again, guys under national security, and nobody's going to go against national security. But the Florida law is the most concerning right as of today. It's very concerning because it now has criminal penalties, like Tong had mentioned. So basically, it jeopardizes the people who buy, the people who sell, and the real estate agents that help them. So now it's putting realtors and real estate agents on the position to enforce these legislations without any guidance from the state. And it's causing these potential violations of these bills. So what does the law say? It says anybody that's domiciled in China that's not U.S. citizens or lawful residents. And yes, there is an exception that persons from China can purchase one property up to 2 acres, but there's very specific conditions, and it can't be within a 5-mile military base, and they have to have a U.S. visa and asylum. And if you're grandfathered in, you had to be grandfathered before July 1st, but you can't buy anymore. And now you also have to register your property. And if you don't register your property, you're going to be fined $1,000 a day. When you sell or buy, the buyers now have to sign an affidavit because that's the easiest. So because this bill was passed so fast, there was no other mechanism of trying to get this to kind of work. So the way that the realtors and the real estate commission kind of came about this was, let's get an affidavit signed by all the parties. So the buyers have to sign an affidavit that they are in compliance of the law. If you are found that you lied about the affidavit, then the state of Florida can actually forfeit, and they can actually take over you have to forfeit your property. And then there's criminal penalties. There's third degree felony penalties up to 5 years of prison, $5,000 fine if you knowingly sold the property. There's the real estate agents can be in violation, and it's crazy because if we talk about it, how do you go about selling a property when you say, hey, Jennifer, like, just wanted to make sure, where are you from? Are you from, so that question in itself is problematic in our eyes, because that's automatically just, potentially causing issues with the fair housing and natural origin. So as real estate agents, as realtors, now we're going to have to be we are now having to be the ones to say, hey, just want to make sure you're not from China, or do you have a U.S. citizen, or do you have a visa, or so you have to start asking all these questions, which causes problems in itself. Let's talk about Georgia. Georgia is a unique case because we were able to defeat the bills, and because we quickly was ARIA as well as ARIA local chapter as well as the Georgia realtors were on it, because the problem with this wording that Georgia had, like Tonga mentioned, was adding the word possessory interest. And Georgia was one of the unique states that did that. They didn't realize that they did that, but they did. And of course, there are other countries. There's China, including Hong Kong, Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Russia, Venezuela, and but they made theirs. The Georgia bill was a lot more unique because, again, it had a 25-mile radius of a military base, military installation, or military airport. And if you live in Metro Atlanta, we have a very big military base in Cobb. So that pretty much took out pretty much all of Metro Atlanta. There's 12 military facilities across Georgia, and every major city is within a 25-mile radius of a military facility. Not to mention the airports, the cargo ports, and the word possessory interest caused an issue because this now caused, for example, a Chinese student that was getting education from Georgia Tech could not rent a room or an apartment because of the word possessory interest. Possessory interest is the right or intent of someone to, they don't own the land, but they're having the right to intend to occupy, or the right to kind of control it, but they don't own it. So the Georgia bill is probably going to be revised in the next session to state a fee interest, an acquisition of a fee interest, not just a possessory interest. So this kind of alleviates the lease portion of it. And they're also going to try to amend the bill so that it only applies to non-residential property, and also eliminate the 25-mile exclusionary zone and replace it with a very specific activity. So all this to say, the Georgia bills and these bills are coming full force. It is coming, and these states will pass it in some form or fashion. It's up to us as the community, as the Asian American community, coming together, our realtors, as well as everyone in this call, to come together and really tell everyone that this is not the correct way, and the bill has to be written in a way that does protect national security without causing these kind of issues in the future.
Okay, thank you so
Sorry.
much for
That was sorry, I know I went on a little tangent, but I wanted to kind of address everything from the real estate side.
No, that's great. And I'm sure there are some things that we can circle back on related to the advocacy as well. And Lily can share her experience with that. But I want to turn now to Dr. Jung. Dr. Jung, Tim mentioned this and Tom mentioned it also, that there's really a historical precedent and context for these types of laws. And so I was wondering if you could just walk us through a little bit of that history and where sort of the origin of these laws is coming from. And we do have some slides for this portion of the presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. And thanks, Asian Americans Advancing Justice Atlanta, for hosting this. Thank you, Tom, for writing a really great report, and Tim's for the background of how realtors will be shaped by this. As both Tim and Tong said, there's historical precedence for these alien land laws, and it's really frightening to see what has happened in the past and how it's being repeated. So let me go to the next slide. And what I want to do is provide an overview of how previous legislation and policies, institutionalized policies against Asian Americans, reflect a yellow peril fear against Asians, and then actually officially treat us as aliens to be excluded, aliens to be segregated, aliens to face legitimized discrimination. So really early on, when Chinese and Asians first came to the United States during the gold rush, they were seen as a yellow peril in that they were invading the West with their Asian racialized bodies. So quickly, California passed the 1852 Foreign Miners Act, and you could see that the governor said that the aim was to check this tide of Asiatic immigration, especially coolies. Next slide, please. This legitimized institutionalized racism continued with a Hall versus California case in which a white person killed some Chinese miners. Chinese testified against George Hall, and he was found guilty and sentenced to be hung. However, he appealed, saying that Chinese testimony shouldn't count, and that appeal was upheld. And the ruling was that Chinese are a race of people whose nature has marked as inferior, you could see it in the slide, who are incapable of progress or intellectual development. Chinese then provide an actual and present danger. So here, clearly, again, Asians and Chinese in particular are portrayed, represented, and actually designated as an actual present danger of very real yellow peril to the United States. Because then Chinese testimony didn't count in courts, Asians had no voice in American government, and that just allowed, actually sanctioned and spurred mob violence against Asian Americans. Next slide. You could see the connection of how policies sanction and legitimate anti-Asian violence with the passage of the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, the first piece of legislation to ban an entire racial group. That bill didn't actually quell violence or racism against Asians, but actually, again, gave the green light for further exclusion. So here on the left, you could see the mayor of Tacoma actually had a turnout, an organized mass meeting. It became the Tacoma method of driving out Chinese from the community. Tom talked about the dispossession of Chinese from land in the 1880s. Over 160 Chinese settlements were actually driven out by mob violence. Again, emboldened by political rhetoric, emboldened by institutional policies. These were wholesale communities, not individuals who lost their property. The picture here is of Monterey, California. My own great-grandparents settled there, lived there for 4 decades, raised families, had homes, had a thriving business, but a fire destroyed their village, and they lost everything and had to move to San Francisco Chinatown as the only place of refuge from racism. Next slide. So when the Chinese were excluded, Japanese were welcomed as essential foreigners, in that they were still foreigners, but they were essential because agricultural interests needed them. But over time, they too faced the yellow peril, racism. And so in the context in 1913 of ongoing anti-Chinese sentiment, but with the growth of Japan as an international power after China defeated Russia in the Sino-Russo War, when Japanese began to become successful farmers in California, and because of white nationalism, where white labor movements thought that California and the United States should be a white nation, and the eugenics movement sort of supporting the racial superiority of white people, all these factors came into play for California to develop its own anti-Japanese policies, and that resulted in the 1913 Alien Land Law. There were mass mob violence in Japan towns previously. There was riots against Japanese being integrated in white schools. And again, because of economic competition, white agricultural interests sought to ban Japanese from buying land in California. Next. So that law, again, aimed to drive out economic competition by Asians, but really the fundamental basis, as you could see here in the speech by the Attorney General of California, the aim of the Alien Land Law was really race undesirability. It's to limit our presence, again, to exclude us by curtailing our privileges. And I think this aim to exclude Asians from the US, this aim to maintain white nationalist perspectives is similar to what's happening today. The current alien land laws have no real national security benefits, but they do have the impact of wanting to exclude Asians and to curtail our presence. Next slide. So you could see that the context of the current alien land laws is really similar to the context of when the first alien land laws were passed. Just as they had anti-Chinese sentiment in the early 20th century, we now have current COVID discrimination against Asians during COVID. In fact, there have been over 60 published articles now, peer-reviewed articles demonstrating the impact of racism on the mental health of Asian Americans during the pandemic. Just as Japan was a rising international power at the start of the 20th century, China is seen as a primary rival of the United States now. There are trade wars with China. And again, there's growing white nationalism in the US, and again, reignited yellow peril fears. So politicians seeing the anti-China sentiment are working to capitalize on it. They're seeking to mobilize on it by passing anti-China legislation, even if that legislation, as Tim talked about, really has no policy impact, as Tom talked about, is actually discriminatory. They're still passing it because it benefits them. Next slide. So if we learn from history, we started Stop API Hate because we knew that whenever epidemics came from Asia, Asians would face interpersonal violence and racist policies. And so we could learn from history in this case too, that if there's over 30 states with alien land laws, we could see the repeat of history and sort of predict what's going to happen. These institutionalized policies are going to heighten the use of anti-China xenophobic rhetoric. You could see politicians using it, and in the upcoming elections, they'll probably use it even more as part of their campaign. That increased rhetoric then correlates to anti-Asian hate. And that's been demonstrated too, that people who see China as America's greatest threat also have stereotypic views about Chinese people. So people conflate the Chinese government with the Chinese people. These people who have stereotypic views also can't distinguish between Chinese in China and Chinese in the US. And so they conflate China with Chinese and Chinese Americans and with Asian Americans. So it's been documented now that, again, the threat of China passing this type of anti-China legislation further stereotypes about Chinese that then get translated towards Asian Americans. And finally, you could, as Tom talked about, that just leads to racial profiling. Real estate people will have to enforce these laws, and so they'll have to engage in racial profiling. And similarly, there are bills now that institutionalize the racial profiling, requiring federal agencies to have staff to monitor unfair economic competition, to investigate suspicious activities. And again, they will then target Chinese. Next slide. So to conclude, just learning from the past, we know that America has skeletons in its closet. This is actually a cartoon, again, from the early 20th century. America, or Uncle Sam, is seen as being hypocritical in protesting Russian exclusion when it was so racist towards Chinese and other Asians. And I think the yellow peril fear today of Americans really stems from the sense of hypocrisy that Americans have, the sense of insecurity of our own economic and international standing. And so to address those yellow peril fears, we have to get at the real root issues of America's economic and international issues. And then we as the Asian American community really do need to continue the advocacy that I see Advancing Justice do today. We really need to change the narrative about who belongs, who's a foreigner, who's a threatening alien. And to do that, I think we really need to develop a sense of deep empathy within America. We're so polarized, but to the greater extent of Asian Americans sharing our stories, that will lead to an understanding of our concerns and empathy to our fears and our own hurts, and then hopefully build to change. So thanks a lot. Look forward to the question and answer time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zhang. And last but not least, I want to turn it to Lily. In Texas, there was a very similar alien land law policy that was proposed. Can you just talk about your experience combating that bill?
Yeah, absolutely. First and foremost, thank you for having me. It's an honor to get to sit amongst these amazing folks and to get to bring a little bit of Texas to Georgia. Whether fortunately or unfortunately, Southern states tend to share a lot of bad ideas. So I know that Texas, Florida, Georgia, right? Like we the API organizations in these states tend to find ourselves fighting really similar battles. So happy to share a little bit about our experience in Texas. So like Jennifer said earlier, I am with Asian Texans for Justice. We are a statewide civic action, civic engagement organization. And so our core mission is to connect APIs in Texas with voting and advocacy and really taking action to shape the narrative and to shape the future of our experiences in Texas. As a new organization, dealing with anti-alien land laws was actually one of our first big hurdles. So SB 147, which is our version of the anti-alien land law, that bill was actually filed about a year ago, actually. It was filed in November of 2022. And our state legislature took it up from January through May of 2023. And so the bill was filed in November, and very quickly in January, the governor tweeted, and this is before the session really had even started. People weren't really aware of this bill. Texas was one of the first states that really garnered national attention around this type of legislation. The governor in January tweeted, if this bill is passed, I will sign it into law, right? So the governor basically doubled down on the idea of anti-Asian or anti-alien land laws. So let me talk a little bit about what that bill was before I go into the advocacy. So kind of what Tom was talking about, similar to a lot of anti-alien land laws, this bill kind of did the same thing. The original version targeted 4 countries: China, Iran, North Korea, and Iran. And the bill prevented individuals, companies, government entities from buying any property. And so this first version of the bill was really, really sloppy. It didn't exclude green card holders. So if you were a green card holder, a legal permanent resident from these 4 countries and lived in Texas, you couldn't buy a home, you couldn't purchase a business, you couldn't, make investments into land or real property of any type. It didn't clarify, when you say China, do you mean people from mainland China? Did it impact people from Taiwan? There was just a lot of confusion. The original bill also really didn't go into enforcement. It didn't talk about how this would be enforced. So as Tim mentioned, realtors, title companies were very upset. We had the farmers associations that were really upset. They were like, wait, what do you mean we can't just sell our land to whoever we want anymore, right? You're saying we're restricted in what we can do? And so the original version of the bill was very terrible. And so not to bury the lead, I'm going to just kind of let you guys know now, we did defeat the bill. The bill did not pass. And let me talk a little bit around how we were able to defeat the bill. So I think there were 3 primary strategies that I think really led us to be successful in defeating the bill. One was around the visibility and the messaging. So from January, when the governor tweeted that he would sign this bill into law, all the way until about the end of April, when the bill was effectively dead, a couple of things were consistent. One, no matter what media outlet, no matter who was doing the interview, no matter who was speaking, we kept saying the same thing. This bill is xenophobic and it's racist, period. We didn't qualify. We didn't say, Asians are Americans too. This is going to discriminate. We didn't try to qualify. We didn't try to explain ourselves. We didn't try to prove that we belong. We just very simply said it's xenophobic. It is racist, period. And it was so consistent. And I would say for a period of 2 to 3 months, every media outlet who reported on it, in that article, you would find the words racist and xenophobic. And so we, as the opposition, could brand it, right? We were branding what this bill was. The other area of visibility is not just visibility in news. Let's be real. Most people aren't reading traditional media outlet and news anymore. So the other aspect of being visible is kind of the age-old tactics of protesting, of rallying, of standing outside the legislators' district offices and holding up signs saying this bill is xenophobic and racist. And that continued to put pressure on the lawmakers who supported this legislation. We were visibly upset about it, and we were kind of, stirring the pot and constantly bringing this back up to their attention. So visibility, narrative, the way you talk about it matters. The second piece that I think is critically important, probably the piece that I would emphasize as being the most important, is the true advocacy. So this is the one-on-one conversations with lawmakers. And this version of the bill in Texas was bipartisan. There were both Republican and Democratic lawmakers who signed on. So you couldn't even argue that this was some partisan political legislation, right? Like you couldn't argue that. There were members of both parties who supported this legislation. And so what we did from January until April is every single week, Republican members, Democratic members, people who held power, chairmen of committees, people who had influence, they had Asian people knocking on their door every week to say, hey, can we sit down? Can I come and tell you why this bill is terrible? And that put pressure on them, right? Because if you're coming to work and every day you're like, oh, I don't know how many Asian people are going to stop by my office. I don't know how many hours I'm going to have to spend talking about this bill. It creates an incentive to not pass the bill, right? It creates this incentive of, okay, maybe if I don't touch the bill, these Asian people will leave me alone so I can go past other bills that are priorities of mine, right? So that's one aspect. And then the piece that was the most powerful for us here in Texas is when this bill came up for a hearing in the Senate, we had over 100 people show up in Austin, and Texas is a really big state. We had folks from all across Texas hop on buses and drive to Austin and sit in the hearing room for approximately 8 to 10 hours, waiting for their turn to provide a 2-minute testimony on why this bill was discriminatory, why this bill was racist and xenophobic, and why this bill could not pass. And of the individuals, of the over 100 individuals who came and testified and shared their 2-minute story, the vast majority of them were people who had never testified and never advocated before. Because our community has not historically been mass mobilizing in recent years. And so having folks go and testify, and many of them shared their own personal stories. They talked about how when they came to the US, they may not have been citizens. And they maybe came on a visa. Maybe they came to be a student. Maybe they came for whatever reason. And over the years, they were able to live this American dream. They were able to buy a home. They were able to invest in businesses. They were able to now make a life. And now they themselves are making impact on the American community. And so sharing those personal stories was so compelling. It was so powerful. It was so important. That really put a pin on how much opposition there was to this legislation that I think really compelled a lot of members to not vote for it. So this hearing was in the Senate. And trust me when I say people on the House side saw what was happening in the Senate, and folks on the House side said, oh, we don't want to do that. We don't want to have a hearing and have over 100 Asian people come to the room and yell at us about how we're filing bad bills. And then the third thing I'm going to say about advocacy that I think is really important is really coalition building. Us rallying members of the Asian American community was really important. The Asian American community going and speaking their truth was really important. But behind the scenes, what was also really important were the realtor associations, were the farmer associations, were the groups that had paid lobbyists who have relationships with members who were able to kind of have conversations kind of behind closed doors to say, hey, this bill is not good for our economy. This bill is unconstitutional, as Tim referred to earlier. This bill would make the realtor and having those allies and those groups within our coalition was also really critical in defeating this bill. So those are the three big things, right? So the visibility, the genuine political advocacy, and then the coalition building. Unfortunately, the bill has popped up again a couple of times in Texas. The bill has died every time, but we do anticipate this to continue on, as speakers before me have mentioned. We do anticipate this bill resurging. We're going to continue the fight, and we're sending all of our positive vibes to the other groups across the South who are facing something similar.
Thank you so much. That's very helpful. Well, I have a lot of questions, but we do have a few questions in the Q&A, so I will Mountain, if you feel like you want to respond, it's just sort of open forum to whoever would like to respond. So the first question says, thank you for hosting this webinar. What do these laws say about entities that are co-owned by both US and non-US nationals that have control over property? If anyone has
I
any
can
insight.
try. This is
Sure.
this is the issue that we're facing, right? And just like Lily alluded to, these are all piecemeal. There's 50 different states trying to pass 50 different legislations, and we don't know. Again, we don't know what's going to happen when it's co-owned by, someone who is of Chinese descent and someone who's Venezuelan. I mean, you're like, where, the problem with these bills again is it was written too fast. It was without any public input, and it's a reactionary, something that's reactionary, instead of sitting down and be like, what's the real issue here? Is it really national security, or is it really we're trying to keep people from China, or because I'm going to call it the anti-Chinese bill because that's where it's really focused on right now. Is are we trying to exclude a segment of the population? What is the real true issue? And that is the discussion that I'm having with a lot of these realtors here, because a lot of them, again, because it's guised in the national security, nobody wants to go against national security. Nobody ever is going to say, hey, we want to, there should be no issues. Now, when we talk about the actual implications of this, that's when everyone's like, huh, wow, I didn't realize this was going to affect the Asian American community. I thought this was, we should be stopping, foreign entities from owning properties. We're like, well, yeah, but you know what? You guys are focused on China, and China owns 3%, like 300,000 acres. I mean, there's nothing compared to Canada. Like, what is the real issue here? And I think that's the discussion that we're all struggling to have, and educating on not only our legislatures, but the people, the electorate that really is that's putting these people in power.
Thanks, Tim. And I assume this applies to the next question. The question was about how about private equity funds or REITs, that like a lot of legislation is just not clear, and some of these details sort of skirt sort of the real issue on like what the purpose of this legislation is.
Yeah, I mean, for example, like Florida, we didn't. The realtors didn't know what to do when the bill was passed. Like everyone's scrambling. There's like all these different people, lawyers and real estate, and again, the temporary stopgap measure is that affidavit, right? Because again, nobody else knew what to do, how to regulate this legislation. How are we all going to get in trouble? And it's a stupid little piece of paper that says I know what the legislation is, I know what's going on, but that doesn't solve any of these issues, right? I mean, it's causing more havoc, if anything else.
Thank you.
And Jennifer, I just wanted to expand on that last question. In Texas, at least, the ban has always only been on real property. And so our bills have evolved, and the most recent versions of the bill actually excludes homes, it excludes homesteads, it excludes businesses. It actually narrowed the scope down to just agricultural land, mineral rights, like natural resources. But it's always been real property. It has historically not been investments. Because let's be real, America is very much run on a capitalistic system, right? We are not a society in which we will turn away investments. These anti-alien land laws are very symbolic in terms of discrimination. These are bills that are not solving a problem because our problem doesn't exist, right? So any legislation that would actually prevent economic development, that's not something most elected officials would actually advocate for. So real estate investments in terms of equity funds, I have not seen any bills that ban anything like that.
Thank you. And there was a question actually that was directly for you also in the Q&A about just if do you expect the bill to be taken up next year? I know it's hard to predict things, but
yeah, that's a great question. I was gonna say, if I were a betting person, I am a betting person. So my bet would be that the bill would not come up in 2024 because it's a big election year. So it's not politically expedient for the Texas population because the API community is growing so rapidly, right? Like when it comes time for votes, nobody wants to upset the voter. But our next legislative cycle is in 2025. And I have zero doubt it will come back up in 2025.
Okay, thank you. This next question is not
from the realtor world, though. We are, and really, I know that hopefully it's not going to come up, and I'm knocking on wood, but we are anticipating the bills to come in some form of fashion all across the U.S. because it is passed. So Texas has been a little more unique. They whittled it down, which is great because of all the community activism, which is amazing to see because that's not, like Lily said, it wasn't the original case. And it's been whittled down to, again, what is the main concern? But I do believe from the realtor world, we're keeping an eye. The legislature, the senators and representatives that we're talking to, they are aware of this as well. So,
Great.
Jennifer, I want to chime in on the question of having shared interests in real property or by business.
Sure.
In some states, they do have a threshold of interest or ownership. It has to be less than the majority of an ownership. In Florida, it's de minimis, which is classified as being less than 5% of ownership or interest in the real property for the prohibition to kind of kick in for the foreign nationals.
Okay, thank you. This next question is not directly about alien land laws, but is, related, I think, thematically to what we were talking about this hour. And it is, are any of you involved with the overhaul of Section 702 on mass surveillance set to expire in December? If anyone wants to talk about it, they can, or I can just talk about it briefly. First, I think, okay. So just as a little bit background for folks, Section 702 is part of the is Section 702 of FISA, which is the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. This was sort of like a very big expansion of sort of post 9/11 powers that the government has to basically surveil people in the United States. And there's been advocacy to, on both sides, sort of to keep those surveillance powers and also to roll some of those back. And so we've been tracking it a little bit. Most of our Advancing Justice Atlanta's focus is on sort of state and local work, but are aware of that. So I don't know if anyone else had anything.
We did sign on to a letter that opposed it as a notice to org, and I believe a number of other Asian orgs, like I think Texas, yes, Asians Advancing, yes, signed it as well.
Great.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that Stop API Hate has been leading some great efforts around this, and so we've signed on to their letter and the advocacy they're doing at the federal level. But similar to what Tom said, we are focused on state level policies. We usually don't weigh in, but we did sign on to a broader statement around renewing it, against renewing it.
All right, thank you. And then I'll do like one more question, I think, and then just because I have one moderator privilege. So, I have two questions. I'll have to pick one. But many of you have talked about sort of like versions of this bill that would be acceptable, right? Like working on, there are versions of this bill that started out really bad and then there were improvements, or like, Tim, you said that we might see a change to the possessory interest or, language or things like that. So just from your, personal perspective, like, is there a version of this type of legislation that would be acceptable to your organizations? Or is the whole, like, as we've talked about, sort of the whole purpose of this bill is just sort of like missing the point and just really not, not something that would ever be acceptable, and just like has so many other effects. Ooh. Sorry.
I can share from a Texas perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, because of the political climate, there is no acceptable version. And I'm going to expand on that to say, while SB 147 is what took up most of the media coverage, there were a number of other bills filed in the Texas legislative session that targeted the same four countries, but it didn't prohibit land purchases. There were bills that prohibited students from these four countries from attending state universities. There were bills that prevented us to use apps that were developed in these four countries. There were bills that prevented us from buying voting machines from these four countries. So the reason why I say there is no version of this that is acceptable is because it becomes a slippery slope. And we start to create more policies that are racist, discriminatory, xenophobic in nature banning land is only the beginning. If you start to open this can of worms, we're just going to start banning all kinds of things, right? And so from our perspective, I would say based on a political climate, there's no version in which we would accept.
Thank you. That's
Can
great.
I add to yeah, so I really appreciate Texas's strategy and the easy narrative that these bills are just racist. That's it. And I really appreciate how Lily says, we don't have to prove that Asians belong or we're part of American history. We just simply have to say these bills are racist. On the face of the bills, the ineffectiveness of the bills, and the impact of these bills, they're just racist. And it's really easy for legislators to, use copycat models. And that's why you see the spread of these state bills. So because they're just copying what other states have done. But if they could see how roundly it gets stopped in Texas, that could be the Asian American model. That if we could really pin racism on these bills, then other states won't want to touch it or even reform it or water it down so it's acceptable. If it's simply racist, then it shouldn't be even, heard. And so I think that strategy, that advocacy is pretty simple. It's actually pretty accurate that it's simply racist. And that's the message we should carry forth. And then the same thing with, the 702 bill is just upfront saying we understand this as racist. We experience this as racist. We've historically known this to be racist. And so quit being racist. And I think, again, not to rehearse the simplicity of it, but I think it is pretty powerful if we could actually brand it like Lily said they were able to do. And maybe, one state's efforts can then really help other states' efforts. We don't have to fight this on a one, grassroots level at another level, but instead just have sort of the concerted strategy.
That's great. Thank you. That's a perfect segue into my conclusion. James, if you can pull up the last slide. We have an ask for all of the attendees here. And, we appreciate your time on this webinar. As mentioned, at the top and sort of the impetus for this is that Georgia does have an active piece of legislation, which stalled last year, was stopped last year, due in no small part to advocacy from community members. We heard directly from legislators that, oh, I received a lot of angry emails about this, and that is why it did not get to the floor. So it moved very far, but it has not gone all the way. And so as Lily has said, and Texas has demonstrated, community action really does matter. It makes an impact. So we would ask all of you to just like be encouraged. That sometimes when you send an email, make a phone call, it doesn't feel like you're doing anything, but it really does matter. And we've heard from folks that it is an empowering experience to do so. We have made it really easy for people to send emails to their legislators. We have that link on the slide, which we'll send out afterwards, will direct you with an email to your legislator with some suggested sample language that you can personalize for yourself. We also will have multiple opportunities to come in person to the Georgia State Capitol in Atlanta. Our Asian American Advocacy Day on February 15th, but also multiple opportunities as part of our larger Immigrant Rights Thursdays program to come, where we will help guide you. We know that sometimes going to the Capitol is not comfortable, but you'll be among experienced advocates and friends and guides to help you talk to legislators about this issue and other issues that are important to you. Again, we will follow all this up with all this information in email, but we would love to see you at the Capitol, or ask you to write an email or call your legislator, and also tell your friends and family to do it as well. More voices are always appreciated. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you to the panelists. This was a really, really great conversation. And I just appreciate all of you. So thank you.